So I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's been a really nice day of just intellectual conversation and, you know, all the nice stuff that you get to do when you're an academic. It's not all nice, right? But that part's nice. So it's been lovely. So I will get started. Let's see, I'm going to go until about 8 o'clock. But yeah, keep it. Okay. So I'm going to tell you about this program that I am one of the founding faculty for that started in the United States and now has expanded to 4 countries globally. So I'll go through all of that and practically talk about what's involved in the summer internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, or SING, but then also talk about some of the analytical frameworks and ethics and values that underlie what we're doing with this program. So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about what indigenization means. Let's see, which way do I present this one? Good, help me. Oh, it turned off. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I was expecting a bigger screen, so I know that's a bit small. So most of these overheads are visuals. So first of all, so I'm going to quote Rauna Kaukonen here at the top paragraph. Rauna is a Sami scholar, and I guess probably most of you know, but that's Indigenous people in the north of Scandinavia, Sami. And so this is a good overview, but pretty vague. Rauna Kaukonen says that conceptually, indigenization represents a move to expand the Academy's still narrow conceptions of knowledge to include Indigenous perspectives in transformative ways. Great. So then I want to draw a little bit, and then I want to go through these definitions because then I will be better able to understand what we're trying to do with the same program. So then what I'm really doing is drawing on Adam Gaudry and Daniel Lorenz's recent article. This came out last year. My old eyes are having a hard time reading this. In Alternative in 2018. And Adam is with us in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. Where's Danielle? I know people here now. Nobody? Anyway, Daniel Lorenz. It's a great article, so I really recommend reading it on indigenization. So they go through 3 types of indigenization in this article and really break down where the different conversations are in the Academy in Canada, and I think it's quite helpful. So they move from inclusion to reconciliation to what I would call actual decolonization. And inclusion is kind of where we are right now. So inclusion, Indigenous inclusion aims to increase numbers of Indigenous students in the Academy. We're doing that in the same program, getting more Indigenous students into STEM fields, supports adaptation of Indigenous students to the Academy. That's key, right? So let's include them, let's help them adapt. It's a little assimilationist, okay? But we do what we have to do. Indigenization is conceived of primarily as a matter of inclusion and access, and by merely including more Indigenous peoples, it is believed that universities can indigenize without substantial structural change. Because as hard as inclusion is, the structural change is a lot harder. So I would say that's the majority of where we are now in terms of the diversification efforts. And then they move on to reconciliation indigenization. And that aims for common or middle ground, creates a broader consensus regarding what counts as knowledge, and then asks how knowledges can be reconciled. So what sets reconciliation and indigenization apart from inclusion is an attempt to actually alter the university structure, including educating Canadian faculty, staff, and students on how they think about and act toward Indigenous people. So reconciliation, despite what a lot of people might say in popular conversations, it's not about reconciling our differences equally. It's actually about what non-Indigenous Canadians need to change in themselves and in their approaches to Indigenous people. What are they going to do? Because colonization was not a two-way street, right? Indigenous people did not really colonize the settlers. So people should be a little bit more careful when they use reconciliation. Okay, so those are those 2. Let's move on to decolonization. We're going to get a little bit even more interested in structural change with this one. So what Gaudry and Lorenz call decolonial digitization, quote, envisions the wholesale overhaul of the Academy to fundamentally reorient knowledge production based on a balancing of power relations. They root some of this in the article in treaty relations in Canada. So it's a very Canadian-focused article, which is great. Although I also work in the US a lot, and there's a lot we can learn from this analysis as well. So based on balancing the power relations between Indigenous peoples and Canadians, transforming the academy into something dynamic and new. And then I jumped to Tuck and Yang's article. So Eve Tuck, who's at OISE at University of Toronto, and Wayne Yang, who's at UC San Diego, at least at this writing. This is a really important article. Decolonization is not a metaphor in Indigenous studies, and people are citing it a lot when they get annoyed with the word decolonization being thrown around in a way that's not very substantive and critical. And so there are a lot of people that refer to this article, so I think it's important to cite. So they say that decolonization brings about the repatriation or restoration of Indigenous land and life. It's not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. The easy adoption of the decolonizing discourse by educational advocacy turns decolonization into a metaphor. And I'm going to attempt to show you some ways in which we're striving not only for inclusion, but also the reconciliation and then moving towards decolonization in the summer internship for Indigenous peoples and genomics. So I wanted to run through those three definitions before I do that. But I highly recommend reading those two articles if you're interested as a faculty member or administrator in thinking about reconciliation, decolonization, and indigenization. So we understand genomic science and technology research and development broadly. I'm talking about the same program and the sort of group of critical scientists and STEM field people that are working related to our program. So we understand these areas and the building of institutions, labs, human resource capacity, including student framing or student training within a framework of repatriating Indigenous land and life. We can also add to that repatriating Indigenous resources. That word resources for me is always in scare quotes. Right? It's resources. I mean, we can talk about human resources, but we can also talk about resources more literally as land and minerals and things like that. The word resources for me is always in scare quotes because it's deanimating what we consider as sets of live relations and beings. It deadens those non-human beings. And so we use those words because we have to. We're engaged in governance, Indigenous people, so we use the words of the dominant culture to talk about those things, but I think that we're thinking about them critically. So for us, land and life includes resources, capacities, political and cultural sovereignty. So this is not us, again, adapting to settler colonialism, but settler colonialism returning what's been taken. So for us within the same program, we think about the return of bodies because ancient remains have been stolen from grave sites and massacre sites to be studied and have been stored and contained in museums and archives since, well, for a while, for centuries. So the bones of our ancestors, there's blood that's archived in freezers around the world. DNA and other kinds of biological samples are archived like other kinds of artifacts around the world, and we're having active conversations globally actually about how to deal, for example, with biological samples taken under older ethical regimes and how to repatriate those, how to use those now within these newer ethical frameworks. So how do we restore not only the material, the biologicals to Indigenous communities, but how do we restore governance authority over those? So these things are always entangled. So thinking about Indigenous governance and regulatory capacity. So we do scientific training, but we're also thinking about these issues at the same time. We think about capacity building, student training, postdocs and professorships. There's a lot of ongoing networking, and I'll show you some pictures of what happens in the program. Funding, building Indigenous controlled institutions and labs. So we're not only about including and browning up and rainbowing up the lab, we're actually about coming in and taking resources back and building up Indigenous capacities and institutions and knowledges. So it's not only about changing what you do here, but like we need this stuff to come back and do what we want to do. So it's not only about adapting ourselves to what we would say are implicitly anti-Indigenous visions of settler scientists, and I'll talk a bit about that. So it's not only about the redistribution of resources, but it's actually being really critical about what questions are asked. Out of whose lives are those questions asked? And towards whose benefit? Towards the building of whose institutions, careers, labs, and human resource capacity. So it's really interesting when you have to do an informed consent form for human subjects research, and they talk about risks, and they talk about benefits, Often the risks will be, well, this particular, needle, or the risk to anonymity, but on the benefit, then there will be no real benefits, of course, short-term to the community or the subject. The actual benefits, the immediate benefits that really are at stake are never discussed, and that's who's getting the resources, the career building, and their labs built. Those are the real tangible benefits, and yet we don't talk about those. So we're going to talk about that in relation to the same program. Okay. Now I'm going to just attempt to tell you stories off the top of my head, which means I can get carried away. But I was always like that, so it's just because of getting older. So this is a picture of the Sing Canada program from this summer. And just to show you, this is the wet lab. So this is them doing DNA extractions and things. I don't go to the labs very much because I'm usually off doing media. So it's not good. I need to get back in there just to see what they're doing. We have changing themes every year. So when the program started in the US in 2011, we didn't do different themes every year. We kind of just made use of the scientific faculty in the Institute for Genomic Biology at the University of Illinois, where we started, and we didn't move around the first few years. We then, as we built up a cohort of young Indigenous PhDs that were coming through, and got other faculty who were committed from year to year from different universities around the United States, we decided we'd move around from university to university, because it's a big job to organize this week-long, it's 7 days training program, and just to redistribute the work a little bit between the founding faculty members. So after those 3 years, we started moving around the US, so we've been in the University of Texas, the University of Washington, University of Arizona, we're going to be in Connecticut next summer, and then, back in Illinois sometimes. And so we started out in Canada when we started in 2018 last year, so we've done 2 years in Canada. We already know we're going to do different universities most every year, and we're going to do them themed. And so our first year was at Simon Fraser, and it was in clam and conservation genomics. There's scientists there working with communities out in BC, and so we were kind of ready to go. They were very, very interested. And then this year, we were at the University of Alberta focused on the genomic aspects of chronic wasting disease. And CWD is really an important topic for Alberta, and I think in Saskatchewan as well. So chronic wasting disease, you may know this, it's kind of the form of mad cow disease that is in elk. It's moving into deer, and they're worried as the ecozones move north in climate change, it's going to move into caribou, right, a traditional food source. But also all of these animals are food sources for Indigenous and non-Indigenous hunters. And while they're doing more research, while there has not been shown to be an effect in humans from consuming animals with CWD, they don't know that for sure. I've also heard prion researchers who study this disease say they would not sit down to a meal with elk and deer. They're worried. So some of the things they're trying to do is develop handheld technologies in the field to actually test, because right now what you have to do is cut the head off and send it back and do testing, and hunters aren't going to do that, right? So we talked a lot about the hunting conditions. We have Indigenous people in the sciences who are working on this, non-Indigenous prion research group at U of A, so it made sense to do this at U of A because we've got the Alberta Prion Research Institute and a lot of research going on in that area. So next summer, we are back at U of A because we're going to work on H. pylori, which, what is H. pylori? It's like a, yeah, it's a bacteria, right? It's really affecting, I don't see, I'm learning, I'll learn. I learned a lot about chronic wasting disease this year. Like I was as a non-scientist running these programs. Anyway, so we're working with the medical school at U of A. With an H. pylori research group that's already got a lot of relations, collaborative research relations with Indigenous communities. This is something we have learned. Sorry, there we go on to the next slide. This is something we've learned actually in our now 8 years of operating SING. You can find scientists who have these different arrays of expertise at the different places you want to go, but that's not all you need. You need scientists who actually know how to work with Indigenous communities, because we don't have time to train them how to teach and work properly with our students, how not to make all kinds of cultural faux pas. Every year we learn lessons. It never goes smoothly every year, but it usually goes great. But Okay, so that was from this year. Oh, and I just meant to say too, so we have an array of people. So this is a graduate student, the young woman on the left, but then we've got a Métis and Indigenous postdoc who's already in the sciences, and then a guy from the community. So what we do is we have traditional students who are trying to recruit into the sciences, but we also get people that are postdocs and assistant professors, Indigenous scientists who have never been in a lab where there's kind of an Indigenous framework and analyses and assumptions that are kind of grounding what's happening. And so for them, it's also a way to professionally network. And they find, oh my gosh, I've had these concerns too. I've had this feeling of alienation too. I've had to work through science in a professional community where people don't get what some of Bioinformatics is about, and they come together and they meet each other. And this has been really important for them. And then community members, we have a couple every year, usually older people that are in governance or regulatory positions within their First Nations or their tribes in the US. So because they're going to be brokering research relationships, and they need to understand what the culture is like and what some of the language is like. So it's very multi-generational, which everybody loves. It's just so great. And then this is the Bioinformatics Lab. This is at the University of Illinois, but we do this everywhere else as well. So they'll do a day or day and a half in the Bioinformatics Lab. Again, it's just kind of orienting you to the culture, because really, what are you going to get done in a week, right? But then they're networked with people who are leaders in their field. So this is Mike DiGiorgio, who I think is now at Berkeley working with, there's a well-known genome scientist there who works on ancient DNA stuff. I'm forgetting his name right now, but he's working in his lab. And so Mike's really well connected in this world. And if they find somebody, a student who's like, oh, I'm really actually interested in bioinformatics, really good contact for them professionally to think, and so they can perhaps get into that world and move in that direction. So we have at the center of what we do are, you call this GELS in Canada. This is the term Genome Canada uses for their ethical social implications funding. So it's ethical, environmental, economic, legal, and social aspects. And in the US, they call that ELSI, ethical, legal, and social implications. So in Canada and then in the US, we will have these, they're largely overlapping, but we'll deal with different sets of national regulations and funding sources and conversations around this approach to genomics. And I don't remember what the percentage set aside is in Canada. In the US, they do 3% of their total human genome funding towards ELSI, and then in Canada, there's also, I think it's a larger percentage actually, that goes towards GELS research up here. Genome Canada is in large part funding our summer program, I think partly through the GELS funding. So we touch on these bioethical frameworks that are crafted internationally post-World War II, but also there are national level policies, regulations, and conversations. So if you do get any bioethical training in the academy, usually in the disciplines, you'll get that national, international kind of bioethical training, but you won't really get Indigenous analytical frameworks and values. And that's what we add. So we do both in those conversations. And we tend to get people who are trained as bioethicists but have paid particular attention to how these frameworks actually work out in Indigenous communities related to Indigenous court cases where universities have been sued, or who gets provenance over biologicals and things like that. So there are people with a specialty in working in Indigenous communities while they also understand these international and national level regulations. So that's an old picture from University of Illinois. Okay, so here is where the program is today. So we were founded in the US in 2011. We moved to Aotearoa, New Zealand, started in 2016. They're headquartered at the University of Waikato. They've got, boy, they're just going gangbusters there. They've got a Genome New Zealand, that's probably what it's called, right? Every country's got that. That's really heavily invested in what they're doing, and they're training Maori genome scientists and people that are also doing social science and bioethics around this. We're doing our global SING meeting. I think it's going to be our first global SING meeting in January back in New Zealand, which I'm tired of flying. It's just bad for the planet and my body, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to go, but I really want to go. It's going to be so amazing for these young scientists. I think the youngins should go, right? Like they should go and meet each other, and because we've brought some Maori students up to the US and to Canada and Australia, and then we're bringing some people back, so just the little bit of exchange we've had has been so exciting for these young Indigenous scientists. So after Aotearoa, we went to Canada in 2018. Sing Australia is starting their workshop, I think, in November, in a week or a couple of weeks. I just saw an email today, they've got like 24 participants. We usually do 14 to 20. I think it's too big, but that's amazing because they were worried actually, because they feel like the pipeline of Indigenous people in Australia that are going towards the sciences, they feel like is much thinner than what we're dealing with up here. So that's really exciting for them. Probably going to be some bumps, though there always is the first couple of years. And then they're talking about Sing Mexico. We've got some scientists that are working in Mexico. I think that's great. One of the concerns I have, we've also had inquiries from South Africa and a couple of other places. I think somebody's working maybe in China. One of the things I have a concern with is indigeneity, as difficult as it is in settler colonial countries like the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, it just doesn't travel everywhere in the world as a concept. It's easier when it's a settler colonialism. When it's not a settler colonialism, there's a lot more contention around whether Indigenous even applies, who's Indigenous if everybody's from there. So I want us to be careful. It's a lot of Americans who are still kind of the majority of Sing. I think we need to be careful just going willy-nilly around the world. We need to make sure that we have people working on the ground in those places who understand the politics of indigeneity in those places. Because the definitions may not be the same. I've even learned that working with Sami people, some of the ways in which they repatriate people back to their communities would be much more controversial for us in the US and Canada. And I've learned a lot about just that indigeneity doesn't work the same everywhere. So anyway, but that said, I think it is exciting that we're getting so much interest globally. So I want to actually share something with you that it's a little mini commentary that I made at one of our sings, because it gets at what we're talking about when we're talking about decolonization in a kind of more nuanced way. So these are just a couple of pictures. The left one from the sing at the University of Washington. It looks like we're really dominated by women. I have to say, maybe 2/3. But you see that in higher education with Indigenous people, right? I feel like often there's disproportionate numbers of women, gender patterns of colonization. So this is from a panel where we're probably talking about genome ethics in Indigenous communities. I'm the only non-scientist up there. So this is one of the things I love. Like, there's so many more Indigenous scientists coming into SING now. When we first were founded in the US, it was non-Indigenous scientists and Indigenous ethicists, of course, right? And you're seeing that really change now, where we've got young scientists at the helm of SING. So you see that in the right-hand picture. Those are young Indigenous scientists that are, well, they're young to me, I shouldn't say that, to me, that are taking over the leadership of SING US. So Katrina Claw on the left is Navajo or Dene, and she just started her first lab at the University of Colorado, Denver. K.O. Lou Fox is an assistant professor at UC San Diego. They were both PhD students in genomics when we started SING, and they came as participants. Nani Ba Garrison in the middle is also Dene, has a PhD in genetics from Stanford, retrained as a bioethicist there under Mildred Cho. Oh man, so many Navajos. Crystal Sosi is at Vanderbilt, finishing up her PhD. I think it's in like health sciences and genomics. And then Joe Irasheta on the right is Purapecha, and he's finishing up his PhD at Johns Hopkins, also working more on public health type stuff. So they're really some of the Indigenous scientific leadership in SING now. But I'll get back to the decolonization stuff. So in addition to the repatriation of resources, if we think about Tuck and Yang saying that decolonization is not simply a metaphor, it requires the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. So I want to think about that in relationship to genomics, Indigenous biologicals, thinking about how those need to be subjected to Indigenous governance, both in kind of contemporary courts and according to customary law. So this is the kind of stuff that I think about. Back in, I think it was at the University of Arizona meeting in 2017, what we do is we give closing comments each day of a same workshop. And so one of the faculty members, but it can also be one of the, well, it's usually faculty members, we will pay attention throughout the day. It's not quite like a discussing gig, but we'll just pay attention in the closing remarks, the last 5 or 10 minutes, we'll say these are the things that kind of jumped out to me or the things that resonated to me for the day. And I gave some closing remarks that I'm going to share with you because they get at what I mean by decolonization in a more conceptual way in relation to this kind of field. So how important Indigenous analytical frameworks can actually not only do that inclusion work and that diversity work, but actually fundamentally shift the founding kinds of ideas that are informing the way the science gets done. So this is a bit philosophical. So I'm going to share those with you now. And so I entitled them Indigenous Science and Technology Sovereignty, Shifting the Narrative from War to Protection. This is to a US-based audience, right? So I'm going to talk about that. Why it's so militaristic. So I said, being inspired today and all week by Katrina Claw and Kaolu Fox, those two on the left of that picture, and the rest of the young Indigenous scientists in the room, I thought about you at one point as an army of infiltrators. Naniba Garrison and others on the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Panel, that's something else we're involved in globally, spoke about efforts by Indigenous communities, technologists, and organizations to control our own biological and other data rather than ceding control of it to settler institutions. They were thinking in terms of hashtag data warriors and asked, what did we think of that hashtag? And we have this data sovereignty Twitter accounts, and they do this hashtag data warrior stuff all the time now. In fact, I think we have a specialty panel at the Global Sing meeting coming up in New Zealand. So back to my comments. So I said, at the University of Manitoba in 2013, I gave a talk entitled, Combating Colonial Technoscience, Lessons from the Front Lines. The University of Manitoba audience, many of them Indigenous scholars and students, laughed at me. They brought to my attention how American that title sounded. I responded, oh, really? So what was so obvious to my non-American audience had not been obvious to me despite my anti-militaristic values. I'll just take you to that. This is this meeting too. This is who I'm talking to, the University of Arizona students. It was like, I don't know Celsius yet. It was about 120 degrees that day. I thought I was going to die. Like you're almost cooking, right? You just stand up there. What is that in Celsius? Like 46 or something? It was bad. Okay, so back to my comments. I mentioned this morning my misgivings about unquestioned U.S. militarization, an integral part of U.S. colonialism here in our homelands, and U.S. imperialism in the homelands of other Indigenous peoples around the world. I've struggled through much of my life with how to reconcile my anti-colonial opposition to the U.S. flag and the patriotism my family largely rejects, with the simultaneous teachings to respect our elders and warriors. As you know, we spend a lot of time where I come from and throughout Indian country honoring veterans. We especially do this at the Wachipi during Grand Entry. It took me decades through my childhood and into young adulthood to eventually settle on the idea that I stand for the Eagle staff, which is at the center and held higher. This is at powwows. The U.S. and tribal flags are held a bit lower on either side, and I stand for our people. When I stand, it is not for that U.S. flag nor any idea of U.S. patriotism. I understand that our people make many hard choices about how to live and survive in this settler world, for example, enlisting in the U.S. military. But I have long questioned the conflation of the Dakota notion of akichita, which is warrior, that's how it gets translated, with Western notions of war and being a soldier. And I've learned not to conflate the land with this nation's state. So how then did I not notice my own easy reliance on war metaphors when I gave that talk at the University of Manitoba? Because the indoctrination of the U.S. and its imperialism goes deep. I wonder, therefore, if we might consider very consciously shifting the narrative from warring and being data warriors and science infiltrators to being data and knowledge protectors. These remarks are particularly aimed at US-based Indigenous peoples. The warrior metaphor may not be something we need to guard against as much when we are Indigenous peoples from a less imperialistic nation state. Like the water protectors at Standing Rock and in the No Dabble movement, can we think of protecting data and these forms of science and technology knowledge that we help build and decolonize? The other value that protection can imply is a recognition of the agency of water, of the land and the material bases of our bodies, not all of which are human, right? Our bodies are inhabited by many non-humans. So we're really a multi-species conglomerate, our bodies. I found the water protectors at Standing Rock to be non-hierarchical in their use of that label for themselves when they called themselves protectors. I really did feel like they were getting at disrupting human, non-human hierarchies, and that hierarchy of life that the sciences inherited from Christianity. So their language at Standing Rock, their language of resistance, including Lakota language and philosophy, to the settler capitalist and police state, recognized our human dependence upon water as a life giver and life carrier. With regard to, and they really spent, I don't think a lot of this was in the popular media coverage, but in talking to water protectors there, because I had a lot of friends that were there that I was in regular conversation with on social media quite often, there was a lot of conversation on the ground about what Minnesota or water means, as water is life. Minnesota means water is life. What that means actually means in Lakota, about the movement of water and the way that it carries life. It's really actually quite biologically and philosophically complicated in the language. And so that's why they were very clear that they were protectors, not necessarily activists, while the rest of the non-native media was portraying them as environmental activists. And it was really interesting to watch the dominant discourses of, oh, this is environmentalism, this is anti-pipeline. Well, that's a kind of flattened way to look at what was happening there. So, with regard to scientific knowledges, protection can also imply that we do not simply produce knowledge, that term knowledge production, about other humans and non-human bodies. Knowledge production is also a term that deanimates, makes less agential our subjects, whether they are human or non-human. So we never, as knowing inquirers, as scientists, we never constitute knowledge of the universe in a vacuum. But we are indebted to the understandings of the universe actually built into the bodies that we study. There's history in those bodies, right? There's an embodiment of knowledge, and we have to pay attention to that. We live in mutual dependence with them. We do not simply get to know them absent agency by them. Settler scientific assumptions about the lesser agencies of human and non-human subjects of study is a chronic problem in their hypotheses and methodologies. It makes the work that they do inherently unethical. Perhaps there are even better Indigenous language words than protector to help you young Indigenous scientists think about these relationships and obligations as you do science. What words and values adhere in our different Indigenous languages that might be better for thinking with? I am not being prescriptive. I know that data warriors is punchy and that matters on social media, but I suggest that our metaphors of choice are culturally conditioned and may therefore integrate core values we may want to think more carefully about, because underlying concepts and values matter. They help generate certain kinds of research questions and not others. Certain kinds of technologies, methodologies, and ethical frameworks and not others. So that's the way in which I try to bring these other kinds of ideas and concepts that we think of more as philosophy or ethics into really having conversations about what kinds of research questions are going to be asked, how are you going to act in the lab and in the field. I was going to say something else and I just lost it. Well, let's go to the next set of pictures. I'm sure it'll come back to me. So then we moved to St. Canada, and these are pictures from 2018 and 2019. So we had 12 Indigenous nations from across Canada and the US represented at Simon Fraser when we did the Family Conservation Genomics. All women except for one young man from a tribe near LA. And I said, is that okay? Like, are you okay? Or are you liking this? And he said, oh, this is great. He was also younger, so it's like a bunch of aunties. That one was really interesting. Every year, it's like, every class you have has a different personality. Every sing has a different personality. So this one, we had a lot of Native women mid-career. Some of them trained as attorneys. We had a science writer, a nurse, somebody else who is a kind of public health person. And so it was really, they were really focused on regulation and governance and thinking about how to inform genome science with language and culture. Oh, that brings me back to the point I forgot. When I was talking to these same students in those remarks, and I do this with my students as well in the Faculty of Native Studies at Alberta, we have a Cree language program, and it's required Cree language for all of our majors. So it's really central to the work that we do. I really encourage our students to theorize out of Cree. So if you are not finding a concept that's working for you, so I teach an Indigenous Feminisms unit in my theory course, and I get some Indigenous women who are like, that's just white woman stuff, I don't want to do that. I'm like, well, but then when we go through the readings on Indigenous Feminisms, they say, oh, well, yeah, I agree with all of that, but I just don't like the word. And I said, well, okay, get into Cree and figure out if there's a way for you to describe and talk about that. I think, so, you know that when you're multilingual, right, you can't translate exactly between different languages because different languages adhere different worldviews. So I think it's really important to pull words and concepts out of those languages that are reflecting a worldview that is the world that you want to live in. And so that's what I told them. And in fact, two of those Navajo young women geneticists are working with Navajo Nation. They've had a genetic research moratorium since 2002. There was a whole bunch of controversial stuff that was happening in the late 90s around exploitative genome research in Indigenous communities in the US, and they just said, no, we're not doing anything until we can build up our regulatory capacity, until we can figure out what we want to take part in and what's in our interest. And now that they've got these young Navajos graduating in genomics, they're beginning to talk about how they can, what kind of research projects they're interested in collaborating in, and they're building up their research review capacity. Like, not everybody can do what Navajo Nation does, right? I think there are 175,000 citizens, and they focus on STEM in their reservation schools. But they're also beginning to think about maybe translating between genomics and the language. So I think that kind of stuff I think is really interesting and important, because that will help guide you methodologically and ethically, I think, towards doing work that serves your communities more. So that's some of the kinds of conversations we have as well. And so you have many different languages. I don't know how to pronounce a lot of those words and peoples and names out of British Columbia. But we had Indigenous communities out there that were involved, and then it was a bit Cree and Métis focused, obviously, the one at Alberta. But that's some of what we talk about. Those are just our sponsors. Oh, that sounds like an advertisement, right? But really, I mean, we do this on a shoestring, and every year I'm surprised that we pull together all the money, but we've been getting a lot of interest. So Genome Canada, Alberta Prion Research Institute is a multi-faculty collaboration. And then those are just the pictures from the different same USAs from different years in Illinois, Texas, Washington, Arizona, back in Illinois. So this was as of last year. It doesn't include 2019, so we're probably up to more like 140 participants across 8 cohorts graduated from SING. And part of what we're going to do in, Part of what we're going to do in New Zealand is the Global SING meeting is going to bring some of the alumni back and see where they are and network them. And we have alumni Facebook pages, and we've had former faculty from SING who now have former participants as PhD students and postdocs in their labs. So there's a lot happening. And this is just a list of what we're going to be doing in Canada over the next few years. I'd like to get to every province and eventually every territory, although I don't know how we're going to do some of this stuff in places where they may not have the same kind of laboratory facilities. But that's also something we need to think about, right? There's big-ass science and little-ass science, and big-ass science is capitalistic. And how do you want to do Indigenous science in a way that you cannot be beholden to capitalism? So that's a question I think we should take on in this, right? And so maybe we'll do more kind of land-based stuff. I'm not sure what that looks like. Well, ask me in 10 years and we'll probably have that somewhat figured out. So Waikato in 2020, this winter, we're talking with Concordia and McGill about doing epigenetics and intergenerational trauma. That's going to be tough though. They did that theme in the US this year and it was hard for people. And so now we know we need to have more content warnings, we need to have a lot more debriefing. So we're going to pay really close attention to that one. And then Simon Fraser and Banfield Marine Sciences are interested in doing a salmon genomics one. And so that'll be it's going to be expensive though, because going to Banfield is more expensive. And then Dalhousie, we're just beginning conversations with them, and Genome Atlantic is getting involved, and I'm not sure what the theme is going to be, but we should have that figured out shortly. So really exciting, and so much interest from around the country. Those are the US ones. Yeah, so Arizona Cancer Genomics, Personalized Medicine, Pharmacogenomics at UW, and then Epigenetics at the University of Illinois. So this is also where we're getting to, and I think this is really interesting. We've started publishing as the same consortium, and we're very strategic about this because we are giving young Indigenous scientists so many opportunities to think more critically about how to do their work, but it's already enough work trying to be in science, right? It's just enough work to get your funding. You know, when you graduate to get a lab set up, and like they don't have enough to do, right? So we're being really strategic about helping them publish. So we very much focus on assistant professors, and some of the more senior faculty will work kind of brokering the publication opportunities. So we've placed things in the Science Policy Forum and Nature Communications, different journals, and we're thinking a lot about where we want these new assistant professors to publish, and then working as a consortium to help get these articles out. So we've usually always got a more senior person who's working behind the scenes, trying to get the opportunities for these kinds of commentaries and articles. And so that's what we're moving towards as well. And we've got some kind of long-term plans about focusing on publishing as a consortium and weighing in on these kinds of ethical issues. So this is really fun. And it's been interesting for me because I'm a social scientist, right? I usually publish alone or maybe with one co-author, and to be thinking about how to manage these kinds of publication relationships is really interesting. So those are publications in the last couple of years that we have, and I don't think it says the journals there. Oh yeah, Nature Communications, Science, and Human Biology. So pretty good. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Should we do Q&A? I didn't come up with a very profound conclusion, but I really love Q&A, so I'm looking forward to the questions.
As Kim said, she loves Q&A, so I'm turning it over for questions from you.
Yeah.
So I saw on your list of future plans in Canada, there's diversity of universities there, but there was nothing in Ontario, is that right?
I don't think we've had any conversations. We were in conversations with people in Manitoba, and that's kind of on hold now. Yeah, I don't think we've had a single one.
Largest population in the country, many universities, and not there.
Yeah, it's not that we don't want to, it's probably just that this is haphazard, right? This is us, people hearing about it, or I go give a talk and then somebody gets interested, right? Or one of our main ethical people from the US moved to Concordia. And so that's why now we've got Concordia and Madrid going, yeah, but yeah, we're totally open to that 2024. So, yeah, especially if there's any genome-related collaborative projects or groups on campus, right? That's kind of, we tend to get approached by people who hear about us because they're doing collaborative relationships with collaborative research with Indigenous communities. Yes. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes.
So thank you for your talk. I was really intrigued by your concept of data protectors or data protectors.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I'm just thinking about interpreting like a set of data through an Indigenous knowledge lens as an act of preventing perhaps another mode of interpretation or a Western-based interpretation. So how do you manage that in terms of like the theoretical frameworks that look at data in terms of where that's coming from?
Well, I'm not part of the Data Sovereignty Network. There's other people in our group that are. So I mean, you can look at, I think I had one of the Twitter accounts. Did I have that on here? Okay. Okay, it must be later on, but it's a Maori data sovereignty. It's a Maui Hudson. So I can give you names if you're interested. People that are on Twitter. So they've got this global network around data sovereignty. So we've got people from Canada, US, and New Zealand that are really heavily involved in that. So they would answer. I can't answer that question. Yeah, yeah. But that's really interesting that's happening. I think they're going to do sub meetings too as well, and they'll probably do that when we're in Waikato in January. Part of it will be on data sovereignty.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask a very naive question?
Yes.
So, if you're interested in STEM education, why did you pick genomics? This is like the most expensive of all of the possible.
Oh, you mean in terms of diversifying genomics, and why not choose something that's not so big money?
Yes.
This was not some planned decision or anything, right? This was an accident. So I wrote this book, Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of Genetic Science, and that was I went to graduate school to do a PhD because I wanted to write that book. I was working as a contractor for the U.S. Department of Energy, and I had worked for the Environmental Protection Agency within their tribal program. And so I spent a lot of time working between federal agencies and tribal science programs. There's a lot of tribal environmental science in the United States because they have treatment as a state, and they can apply for funding along with states to do environmental regulatory work.
You do a lot of genetics without any genomics.
Yeah, well, okay, so I have nothing to do with this field, and I'm working for DOE, and suddenly they decide to start pouring a lot of their, decide to start funding the mapping of the human genome. And I had been working on nuclear waste policy stuff, and the organization I was working for started holding these consultation meetings for what are the implications for Indigenous peoples of the mapping of the human genome. And I heard all this very interesting, misinformed stuff being said around these consultation tables, and I knew that I wanted to write that book. So I ended up studying genome scientists because I found what they were doing, especially human population genetics, really problematic for Indigenous communities. And I got tired of just being critical all the time and going to American Society for Human Genetics, and people are sitting in the audience shaking their heads at me, and I was like a pariah when I walked in the room. And then I thought, I'm a feminist. Part of being a good feminist is caring for your subject. You know, being invested in the projects that you critique, and I was not invested in these. So I went and found critical scientists whose projects I could be invested in, and I met all the scientists that we ended up founding SANG together. So that's how. That was my short version of that answer.
There are consortia that are looking at genome diversity in the world. There's a project that's ongoing called the 1,000 Genome Project. And it's looking at variation in genome in various populations. Caucasian populations tend to be overrepresented. There is a huge technological capacity, and I think they want to expand. And I think I can see our organization as one that could easily lobby this resources. It's a huge amount of money that is poured into these projects. It's multinational, and it's very well organized to go and enhance our knowledge of genome diversity, looking at indigenous population. In fact, we have expertise in Canada through Genome Canada, and part of this consortium. I don't know whether you in your policy, if data mining and influencing this consortia is actually part of the program.
In SANG, we've tended to stay away from human population genetic stuff because it is so controversial in our communities. And most of our participants are working in other areas. It was really interesting. They deliberately stay away from Indigenous bodies, human bodies, when they're in their work. So, and we have been approached by different organizations who want to collaborate with us, but we're pretty careful because, again, they have to be scientific research groups who really who have a history of working with Indigenous communities collaboratively, and that's not easy to do. It can really derail your science. It takes longer to publish. Science doesn't work that way, right? So the scientists that we've worked with tend to be people that are okay with making a significant part of their intellectual output methodological and ethical interventions. And of course, not everybody's willing to do that. And I think if you're not willing to do that, fine, just don't work with Indigenous communities. But if you want to work with Indigenous communities, you have to be willing to get your research reshaped in this kind of way. So that's partially an answer to me.
So do you see the role of the next generation, therefore, to be trained and to be able to go and access these sources?
I'm sure that's on their agenda. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm the older person who, yeah, I mean, I'm not a scientist, right? And they are having those kinds of conversations. Yeah, because they've got to fund their work, right? And they're grappling with that.
My question is a bit of a departure, I think, but I was wondering about working with Indigenous folks from different communities, and I hope that you could speak a little bit to the various perspectives that they bring, because often in conversations like this, we talk broadly about Indigenous knowledges, and I'm sure there are shared strands, but at the same time, there's such a diversity of perspectives that come too. And so I wondered about how those perspectives interact in different projects and what some of the interactions have looked like, or how they've affected kind of the outcomes.
I mean, I can give you some vague examples about particular research projects, but I also, within the same program, there are meaningful differences between different Indigenous communities about whether they want to participate in certain forms of genome research or not. I haven't written on this, so I'm kind of thinking out loud here. Those differences tend to be perhaps less about their traditional knowledges, quote unquote, although I can't say that for sure, and more about the histories of their relationships with non-Indigenous peoples in the area. So, or maybe the emergence of their Indigenous cultures in relationship to settler colonialism. So if I think about the Maori, and they've got, and we will have, Maori people come up to the US, and we'll have Americans and we'll have people from Canada. They tend to have a different approach in New Zealand, but they're one language group, and they're 16% of the population. They are much more powerful nationally, I would say, a much more powerful presence than is the case in the US and Canada or Australia. And they tend to be more, they're very critical. I mean, if you've been around Maori people, they're very critical and very vocal in support of their rights and their worldviews, but they tend to be easier with thinking about working on genomics projects with the state, I think, because they feel a greater sense of power in relationship to those institutions. And so I think that's why they've made such quick progress in developing genome or Sing Aotearoa. They're really moving to the fore and they're the ones hosting the global meeting, right? And they're the ones getting the resources to do that. It's really interesting to watch them. And then the kind of support they're getting from the Genome Agency down there. Then you come to the US and you have people in certain parts of the country who've had a very historically contentious relationship with science and very suspicious. And this is some of our bumps in the road at different SING programs that happen like that. You'll get, some Indigenous participants who are like, let's do this is interesting. And others that are like, this is colonial. And we've had those things erupt in the classroom and in the laboratory. And I think part of that is, I think as much as it's our traditional worldviews, it's those kind of state history of working with the state, right? And then if for a research project, there's one set of ancient remains that were found around the same time as Kennewick Man, or the ancient one was found, and the Kennewick Man was a very controversial find. But the one found up in Alaska ended up being less controversial because the genetic archaeologists that found them already had a long-term collaborative relationship with Indigenous communities there, and so they already had a sense of trust and protocols worked out for what they were going to do with the remains and how they were going to be researched and reinterred. They didn't have no controversy around this. The other thing is, those communities there know that they have relations with communities on the other side of the Bering Sea. They already have those relations, and now, not just way historically. And they just weren't wigged out by genome research establishing those relations. Because the worldview, the relational worldview was not being imposed on them by settlers. That's what happens in a lot of this human migrations research. It's an immigration narrative, settler worldview that's imposed on us, and we don't do relationality in that way. Does that kind of, so there's all kinds of things that come together in how this works and how controversial it is.
started with definitions surrounding the university in particular.
Yeah.
And as you've been going through what the same project or program does, I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit more on how Sing is imagining or actually enacting now. Like, what is Sing attempting to tackle whilst kind of connected to this other colonial institution? Because it's on my mind.
It depends on who you talk to, right?
Yeah.
So some of our Indigenous PIs who are in their first few years of starting their own lab and assistant professorships, they want to get tenure, they want to build their lab, they want to mentor other Indigenous scientists. And it's not only Indigenous scientists, we have, if you ever go to SOCNIS, the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science, or the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, it's not only Indigenous and Latinx students that are there, there's also Black students, there's like white working class, anybody who's not supposed to be in science, right? Like Google scientists, when you get an old white guy in a lab coat, you don't get queer people, you don't get anybody disabled, you don't get anybody of color, right? You don't get any tatted up young person. And so there are similar kinds of barriers and cultural barriers that occur. And so they'll talk a lot about that, right? And they'll try, and they're very conscious of what kind of space are they making in their lab? You know, who's comfortable here and who's not comfortable? For me, I've got this other agenda, right? I want to do social theory work, decolonial social theory work. Some of the non-Indigenous scientists want to recruit people into their labs, you know, so we do have different agendas. And we don't totally agree on everything. I've had a conversation with one of our scientists in the US who's very clear that I can get away with saying things that they can't because they're trying to get NIH money and I'm not. And I'm like, yeah, so let me say it. You go do your, you don't have to say it. We don't all have to be saying the same thing. I'm going to use another military metaphor. I'm thinking, so I'm so American. I'm like, you know, you can do reconnaissance here and you can do defense there. Like you've got, maybe I should use a basketball metaphor instead, right? Like different. You have different roles in the defense on the court. Yeah, I'm going to work on it. So yeah.
Thank you so much. This is such incredible work. Thank you for coming and sharing. I'm wondering if you could walk us a little bit through these sort of nuts and bolts. So if we show up and we're students that want to participate in one of the programs, what would we expect in sort of the day-to-day?
Oh, day-to-day?
Yeah.
I should schedule it. They show up on a Sunday night and we have a welcoming dinner and we have a welcome from an elder. So we pay for everything, all the transportation, all the food, and if we don't provide meals, we provide a cash per diem up front because reservations and reserves in Indigenous communities are cash economies and do not assume people can wait to get reimbursed. We do that for our elders as well. We Uber or taxi them in, we feed people, we give them their money at that right up front. So the first night's a welcome, and then we go Monday through Saturday with full days, although usually on Thursday we have a field trip or something because by then they're burnt out and need a bit of a break. But they'll move between the DNA lab, the bioinformatics stuff, we'll have lectures on the ethical stuff, we'll do the field trips in the middle of the week, we'll have dinners, mentor dinners, usually once people get there, they've been there for a couple of days, we'll match up, or the participants will do a list of the 3 mentors they're interested in working with, and then we will construct groups and we'll do mentor dinners on Tuesday or Wednesday night. The mentors and the participants will all go out together. We have talking circles during the week, so a couple of them punctuating the week so people can debrief. Again, every year, despite our best intentions, there are some bumps and there are some things people need to talk about, right? Where they feel like something happened in the lab that I didn't come to Sing for that kind of lab experience, and so we've got to talk it through. And then at the end of the week, we have a presentation of certificates and we have another closing by an elder. We usually have a nice dinner. So, do you have any particular questions? There's probably things I'm leaving out too.
No, I think that clarifies a lot. And I'm just curious, what prior knowledge do you assume for the participants? I know you said, oh, there's some career folks, there's some attorneys and things. How much exposure have students had before coming?
Well, it's more, is this the kind of program that will work for them despite their diversity of backgrounds and interests? So we do telephone interviews as well. We learned that after the first couple of years because we had a few people show up and it was not what they expected. So now we'll, once we go through the initial list of applicants, and there's always some you can kind of toss right away, we will then call them up and do interviews and make sure that it's the right program for them. And then there are some who we thought were good candidates who say, oh yeah, no, that's not exactly. The other thing, you have to commit to the whole week. So you can't bring your partner with you. We have had people with children, and we do try to accommodate that. You know, if you need to bring your child, we'll try to deal with childcare and all that. But this is full on 7 days, and so it's not like a conference, right, where you can go out and leave at night. So it's that kind of level of commitment, and we put people all up in the same hotel or on-campus housing facility so they can really network and be together. They share breakfast together as well every morning in the same place. So, yeah. Yes.
Hi. So I'm in the data science. I just want to question for the program. So have we heard back from participants in terms of how their experiences or how their growth has changed, how they, when they go back to school or when they go back to work, how they...
I had some evaluation quotes in this, and I took them out. I'm trying to remember, you know, I'll just have to talk off the top of my head. They really do develop this professional network, and they stay in touch. I mean, we have a Facebook page and an alumni page, but sometimes they start their own because they want to say stuff that they don't want the faculty seeing. But they do end up coming back. Often the participants will come back as faculty the next year. So that postdoc, that Métis guy who's a postdoc, is going to come back as faculty for us. And and also, even though they may be coming, you may be coming to a SING that's themed in an area that's not really what you're studying. People do it anyway because they get the networking, right? They meet other Indigenous scientists, that they remain part of their professional network. So I think that's the main thing they get out of it. Also the contacts with different Indigenous professors or non-Indigenous professors who are really committed to collaborative research. But we do have, we have testimonies on our SING Facebook page if you're really interested. So yeah, for those that are interested in applying, even if it's not in your particular area, that's totally normal. Many of the people who came to the chronic wasting disease one this summer work on other stuff. Yeah. But then some of the younger ones get interested in that. There's wine and food back there too, I think. Tired.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I would like to thank everybody for coming, but I would especially like to thank Dr.